Link was not always right-handed, and Nintendo changed it without ever changing him. A new controller needed a sword arm on a different side, so an entire game world got mirrored just to keep the hero's grip consistent. Once you see how easily Hyrule bends to fit the hardware, you start wondering what else you remember that was never actually fixed in place. Link's handedness. Link has been swinging his sword with the wrong hand for most of his existence, and Nintendo is the one who broke him. For the first 2 decades of this franchise, the hero of Hyrule was left-handed, not a fan theory, not a guess. Official, consistent, drawn that way across the earliest games and every piece of concept art that mattered. Then Nintendo built a console with a wand in it, and Link's entire skeleton got rewritten just so he could hold that wand correctly. That console was the Wii. Twilight Princess launched on GameCube and Wii at the same time, and the Wii version leaned entirely on motion controls, with the Wii remote sitting in most players' right hands. Nintendo wanted Link's sword arm to match the arm actually holding the controller, so they didn't bother animating a new sword hand. They flipped the entire game world horizontally instead. Every dungeon, every village, every single dot on the map got mirrored like a reflection in a bathroom mirror. Also, a cartoon boy would swing right instead of left. That's not a character update. That's flipping an entire country to avoid redrawing one arm, and the flip stuck. Breath of the Wild kept Link right-handed. Tears of the Kingdom kept him right-handed. 2 of the biggest games ever made, played by tens of millions of people, quietly inherited a handedness that only exists because of a peripheral bundled with a console from 2006. Nintendo's own staff have tried to explain it, eventually landing on Link being left-handed, mostly. Not left-handed, not right-handed, mostly. That's a company admitting on the record that there's no fixed answer, just whichever hand the current hardware happens to need. Think about what that means for anyone who grew up thinking they knew this character down to the wrist. You didn't memorize a trait, you memorized a workaround and you never even clocked the swap. And if the hardware could quietly flip which hand he swings with for years without anyone noticing, ask yourself what else got swapped while you weren't looking. Because there's something on the title screen that's been lying to you longer than the sword hand ever did. Zelda isn't one person. Every single newcomer makes the same mistake, and it is not the one you think. They walk in assuming the green guy is called Zelda. Fine, harmless, everyone corrects them within about 5 minutes. But the correction fans give back is also wrong, because it assumes there is one consistent her to correct people toward. There isn't, there's never been one Zelda. There's a name that keeps getting handed to a new person, generation after generation, and the franchise just never bothered updating the label on the box. Walk through the timeline and you get different royal lines, different eras, different women, all answering to the same 4 letters. Some are born into it, some inherit it through blood and politics, the way any royal title gets passed down a family tree, and some get it the strange way. In Skyward Sword, the name traces back to the goddess Hylia herself, reincarnated into a mortal girl who happens to inherit the title along with the body. So is Zelda. A birth name, a job description, or a soul getting recycled through Hyrule's royal family like a lease nobody reads the fine print on. Nintendo has genuinely never picked one, and committed. Nothing in canon states outright that Zelda functions as a dynastic title rather than a personal name, but follow the pattern. A name that survives reincarnation, gets reassigned across unrelated timelines, and gets slapped onto whichever princess is currently in the story, stops behaving like an identity. It starts behaving like a crown. Somewhere in there is a kid who just wants to be a girl with a name, not a vessel a goddess keeps checking back into, and the games never really let her have that. We already watched Nintendo redraw a hero's own hands without telling anyone. Now the title character of the entire series turns out to be less a person than a position that keeps getting filled. Same trick, bigger target, same company shrugging about it 40 years later. So the hero's body is negotiable, and the princess is a naming convention. Fine. Surely something in Hyrule has stayed genuinely, brutally consistent for 40 years. And it has. It's just not the part anyone would have picked. Cuckoos. A farm bird has killed more Links than most bosses in this entire series, and Nintendo has never once apologized for it. That is not an exaggeration for effect. Hit a Cucco enough times in A Link to the Past, and every Cucco within earshot drops what it is doing and swarms you. Feathers everywhere, claws everywhere. Link, sword in hand, hero of time, getting mobbed to death by poultry. The surface explanation is that it is a joke. A little punishment for players who cannot resist poking things with sticks. And sure, that is true. but sit with the fact that this joke has survived completely intact since 1991. Link's hands have swapped sides. Zelda's face and voice have been rebuilt more than once. Entire kingdoms have been redrawn on the map, and through every single one of those changes, the Kuko has stayed exactly, precisely, insultingly the same. Players have documented the pattern across decades of entries. Peck one Kuko in a village, and it is fine. Peck it 3 or 4 times, and suddenly you are the main character in a horror movie starring chickens. The exact numbers shift game to game, nobody agrees on the threshold, but the lesson gets learned the same way every time. You hit the bird remembers, then the bird's friends remember too. Ask any longtime player about their first Kuko swarm, and you will watch them wince just for a second, like it happened yesterday. The joke only works because of that gap between what a Kuko looks like and what a Kuko does. It is a small, stupid, clucking farm animal, drawn with the same soft roundness as every other background prop in Hyrule. There is nothing about its design that screams lethal. That contrast is the entire mechanic. Nintendo never needed to explain it, justify it, or update it, because the joke does not require logic. It requires memory. And that is the strange part nobody clocks until you say it out loud. This chicken has outlasted royal bloodlines. It has outlasted timelines. It survived because nobody in Kyoto ever looked at the Kuko and thought it was important enough to fix. A bird outlasted a bloodline. But if the small things are the stable ones, then the biggest thing of all, the ground everyone stands on, should be the least stable thing in the entire series. And it is. Every Hyrule differs. Nintendo once flipped an entire country because of a wrist. Not a metaphor, an actual documented fact. When Twilight Princess moved from GameCube to Wii, the developers mirrored the whole game horizontally so Link could swing the remote right-handed, and that meant every field, every mountain, every castle wall got flipped along with him. The callback from earlier hits different once you sit with it. That countrywide flip was never really about Link's hands. It was about how little Hyrule itself mattered next to the convenience of the controller in yours. Zoom out from that one flip and the pattern gets bigger, not smaller. Hyrule shows up as a tight little box you can cross in 10 minutes in the original 1986 release. It shows up as a sprawling, disconnected patchwork of floating landmasses and sky islands in later entries. It shows up as one continuous, unbroken continent you can climb, glide, and paraglide across for 100 hours in Breath of the Wild. Same name on the title screen, completely different planet under your feet. Death Mountain isn't always in the same place. Lake Hylia isn't always the same shape or the same size, or even always a lake. Kakariko Village moves, shrinks, grows, changes its entire skyline depending on which console it's rendering on. Fans have spent years laying these overworld maps on top of each other, trying to prove one of them is the real Hyrule, the authentic one, the one every other version is secretly based on. That argument can't be won, because it's the wrong question. Nothing in canon states this directly, but follow what 40 years of level design actually shows you. Every single Hyrule was built to serve the game it's attached to, not to preserve a geography anyone swore to protect. A compact map serves an 8-bit adventure. A fragmented map serves a puzzle box dungeon crawler. An open, unbroken map serves a game about climbing anything you can see. The land gets redrawn to fit whatever story Nintendo is telling that generation, which means the thing players think they've memorized, the actual shape of home, was never fixed to begin with. You can love a childhood map and still be loving something that only existed for one console generation before it got quietly redrawn underneath you. If the geography is this disposable, if mountains and lakes and villages are just furniture Nintendo rearranges on a whim, that raises an uncomfortable question about anything in this world that claims to be permanent. Nintendo will rebuild the ground under your feet without flinching, but there's one thing they built to stay in your head permanently, and they did it by making it hurt. Navi, every other Nintendo character in this video, earned survival by getting smaller. Navi did it by getting louder. That's the trick nobody clocks right away. Ocarina of Time needed a way to teach players an entirely new kind of Zelda, one with a real camera, real depth, real ways to get lost in 3 dimensions instead of 2. So Nintendo built a fairy whose entire job was making sure you never stayed lost for long, fly up to something interactive, and she'd chime in, hover, wait, ignore her, and she'd say it again, and again. Hey, listen, was not a suggestion, it was a leash. Players have quoted that exact line for over 25 years, not fondly either. It became the most impersonated, most parodied, most groaned about piece of dialogue in the franchise's history. recreated in memes, ringtones, and roughly 1,000 YouTube compilations dedicated entirely to how much people wanted her to stop talking. Zero other companions in Zelda have ever inspired that volume of dedicated hatred. Zero. Nothing officially confirms Nintendo wanted that reaction. But follow the pattern for a second. A guide who only spoke when needed would have blended into the background, forgettable, replaceable, like a dozen other tutorial systems in a dozen other games. Navi doesn't blend, she interrupts, she repeats, she refuses to let silence do the teaching. That is not what a helpful tool looks like. That's what a retention mechanic looks like, dressed up as a fairy. And here's the part that should bother you more than the interruptions themselves. The kid playing this game in 2000, the one who grew up thinking Hyrule was a fixed place he could always return to, wasn't just learning a control scheme. He was being trained, hey listen. At a time to associate this world with irritation he'd still remember decades later. That's not nostalgia surviving by accident. That's nostalgia surviving because it left a mark. Compare that to what kept Sections 3 and 4 alive. Those details survived because Nintendo forgot they mattered enough to touch. Navi survived because Nintendo made her impossible to forget in the first place. Two completely opposite strategies. Invisibility on one side, irritation on the other. Somehow they land in the exact same place. Still here, 40 years later, still part of the memory. Annoyance sticks. Silence sticks. But there's a third way to survive this long in Hyrule, and it might be the strangest one of all. Be so utterly beside the point that removing you never even occurs to anyone. The fishing minigame. Nintendo has redesigned Link's face, his voice, and which hand he swings a sword with. They have never once had the courage to close the pond. That is not a joke. Go back through 40 years of hardware, art styles, and total engine rebuilds, and one activity survives every single console generation untouched in spirit. You stand at the edge of some water. You wait. You catch a fish that does absolutely nothing for the plot. Nothing. And somehow that has been true since the Game Boy screen was the size of a stamp. The official explanation is that it's just a minigame, a throwaway distraction bolted onto the side of the real adventure. Zelda games are stuffed with those. Most of them get cut, replaced, or quietly forgotten between installments. Fishing is different. It got rebuilt, from scratch, in game after game, on hardware that had nothing in common with the last version. Ocarina of Time had a pond. Twilight Princess had a pond. Breath of the Wild let you spear fish with a literal stick, and somehow that still counted as the same tradition. Different controls, different rewards, different rod, same basic promise every time. Stand still, be quiet, catch something. None of it moves the story forward. Zero main quests require it. Zero bosses live in that pond. You can beat every mainline Zelda game without ever picking up a rod, and the credits will not care one bit. And yet ask any longtime fan what they remember most clearly, and a shocking number of them will describe the fishing hole before they describe the final boss. That is not an accident of nostalgia. It is the whole mechanic working exactly as intended. The rest of Hyrule is built on urgency. Timers, temples, a fairy screaming directions at you. The pond asks for nothing in return. No stakes, no failure state that actually matters, no voice hurrying you along to the next objective. For a kid who grew up treating these games as one continuous, unchanging memory, the pond was the one place that felt like it never got rebuilt around them, even while everything else quietly was, piece by piece, generation by generation. Compare that to what survived the last section. Deku Scrubs and Gorons stuck around by being too weak or too small to justify the effort of cutting. Fishing did not even need an excuse that flimsy. It was never structurally load-bearing enough to threaten anything. Cutting a boss breaks a game. Cutting a pond breaks nothing except somebody's Tuesday afternoon, and Nintendo has decided repeatedly across multiple hardware generations that a Tuesday afternoon is worth protecting. So the map gets redrawn, the hero gets recast. The pond stays exactly where you left it, waiting, quiet, completely unbothered by any of it. Uselessness, it turns out, is not just how you survive in this world, it is apparently how you get to stay in it forever. But there is one resident of Hyrule who pushed that same idea past a minigame and into an entire personality, and the world he lives in never treated him like the punchline everyone else decided he was. Tingle. Nobody in Hyrule has ever laughed at Tingle, not once. Not one guard, not one shopkeeper, not one villager in any game he has ever appeared in. That silence is the whole joke, and it says more about us than it does about him. He shows up in Majora's Mask as a balding man in a green suit who sells maps and occasionally floats around in a balloon, and inside that world, that's just his job. He does it well. He is, by the internal logic of Hyrule, a completely normal side character offering a completely normal service. the world never treats him as strange. We do. Somewhere between his first appearance and now, Tingle stopped being a map salesman and became a punchline with a fanbase. He got his own spin-off games, he got merchandise, he got a reputation as the most divisive man in Hyrule, adored by some players and loathed by others, and none of that reputation exists inside the game itself. It was built entirely outside it, by us, in forums and reviews, and increasingly unhinged fan art. That's the trick nobody clocks. Section 6 already showed you that uselessness is what keeps a detail alive, that Nintendo protects the stuff that never had to matter. Tingle proves you don't even need Nintendo for that. The players did it themselves. They took an ordinary background character and reclassified him as an icon of pure chaos, and Nintendo just quietly went along with it, leaning into the joke in later games without ever admitting the joke was ours to begin with. Nothing in canon says Tingle knows what he's become, but follow the pattern, because it's right there. A man who has spent every appearance treating his life as completely ordinary, while an entire audience decided without asking him that he is the funniest thing in the franchise. He sells his maps, he does his job, he has no idea he's a legend for reasons that have nothing to do with the maps at all. There's something quietly sad in that, if you sit with it. He is loved for a version of himself he never performed and never agreed to, so we can rewrite a character just by laughing at him, and the world quietly accepts our version. But there's something in Hyrule the world accepted so completely that nobody ever thought to laugh at all, and it's genuinely insane. The Goron diet. A beloved species in this franchise eats stone, actual rock, straight off the ground, and nobody in 40 years has stopped to ask how that works. Not once. No cutscene, no scientist Goron explaining digestive enzymes, no side quest where a confused traveler asks the obvious question, Gorons eat rocks the way you eat toast, and Hyrule just nods along. Walk into Goron City, and this is not treated as a survival quirk or a desperate wartime adaptation. It is treated as Tuesday. Merchants sell rare rocks as delicacies. Elders praise a good dense boulder the way a sommelier praises a vintage. Kids beg their parents for rock candy that is, functionally, candy made of rock. The whole culture is built around it. The mining, the mountain homes, the thick stone-colored skin that looks less like flesh and more like the exact material they are chewing through breakfast. Every piece of who Gorons are points at the same conclusion. Anatomy, geography, tradition, all built on a joke nobody agreed to call a joke. Compare that to Tingle. An entire community looked at one weird man in green tights and rewrote him from scratch, gave him a whole alternate identity out of pure refusal to accept him as written. That took effort. Rocks for Dinner took zero effort, because nobody pushed back long enough to need a rewrite. That is the uncomfortable part. You accepted this as a kid without blinking, and you never once revisited it as an adult. The premise never had to earn your belief. It just had to show up in enough games, enough dialogue boxes, enough loading screens, until questioning it started to feel like the weird move instead of the normal one. Nintendo did not invent a food chain here. It repeated one until the repetition became the explanation. Say a thing enough times in a world people already love, and it stops sounding like a claim. It starts sounding like furniture, something that was always there, something you'd feel a little silly asking about now. And that is worse than a rewritten prankster in tights. That is a franchise quietly training you to stop asking questions, one boulder-shaped snack at a time. Repeat something enough, and it stops being a claim and starts being furniture. But not every piece of Hyrule got its authority from repetition. One of the most beloved things in the entire series borrowed its authority from somewhere much older and much realer. Epona, every other horse in gaming is just a horse. Epona is a goddess. Not metaphorically, not as a compliment either. Nintendo took the name directly from an actual deity that actual people once prayed to. Epona was a real Celtic horse goddess, worshipped across Gaul and eventually adopted by Roman cavalry, tied to horses, fertility, and protection on long journeys. That's not a fantasy invention dressed up to sound old and mysterious. That's a religion full stop, with real altars and real believers. Link's most iconic companion first galloped across Hyrule Field in Ocarina of Time, and the name stuck so hard that nearly every mainline horse since has carried it forward. That's decades of playtime, an entire emotional backbone of the franchise, built on top of a name Nintendo didn't even have to invent. Compare that to the Gorons, grinding out their credibility through sheer repetition, the same rock-eating tribe showing up game after game until familiarity finally did the heavy lifting. Epona skipped that entire process. She showed up already ancient. That's the quiet trick here. A goddess people once left offerings for now exists mainly to help you find shortcuts through Hyrule Field. Nintendo didn't need 40 years of appearances to make her feel mythic because the mythology was already sitting there unclaimed, thousands of years old, free for the taking, and it explains something a little uncomfortable about why she hits so hard emotionally. Every kid who lost Epona to a Stalfos ambush or a poorly timed cliff felt something real, the same ache of loving a piece of Hyrule that turns out to have been borrowed the whole time. You grew up thinking that connection belonged to the game. Some of it belonged to a religion that existed long before Shigeru Miyamoto was even born. So the most trusted, most emotionally durable creature in the entire franchise isn't a Nintendo original at all. She's rented weight, a name doing work the game never had to earn on its own, dignity imported wholesale instead of built one appearance at a time. Nintendo can reach into a dead religion and pull out instant history whenever it needs to. But the most persistent figure in this entire franchise never needed a goddess behind him, or a legacy, or even much of a personality. He just needed somewhere to be. The Postman. Link's hands have been redrawn. Zelda's face, her name, her entire royal lineage have been rewritten more times than anyone at Nintendo would probably like to admit. The map has been demolished and rebuilt from zero at least once, and through every single one of those resets, the mail still gets delivered on time. That's not a joke about efficiency. That's genuinely strange when you sit with it. The Postman first became a real character in Majora's Mask, sprinting around Clocktown on a schedule so exact you could set your own watch to his patrol, panicking about deadlines while the actual moon was falling out of the sky. He wasn't a boss, he wasn't royalty, he was a guy with a bag and a route, and yet he kept showing up. Different games, different Hyrules, different centuries as far as the internal timeline is concerned, and somehow the same nervous man with the same job description kept getting reinstalled like a piece of default software. Nobody in Hyrule has a resume that's stable. Kings get overthrown. Heroes get sealed away for 7 years at a time. Entire pantheons get retconned. The Postman just keeps walking his route because a job title doesn't need a backstory to justify existing in the next version of the world. Think about what that actually means next to everything else. This video has already dragged out of the woodwork. A weapon needed a myth to survive rewrites. A costume needed decades of repetition just to earn the right to be called canon. The Postman needed none of that. He didn't borrow permanence from anywhere. He just had a function so basic that Nintendo could drop him into any timeline, any art style, any Hyrule, and players would instantly understand what he was for without a single line of dialogue explaining it. That's the quietly upsetting part, if you actually grew up with this stuff. The version of Hyrule you remember as a fixed childhood place was never fixed at all. It was rebuilt around you constantly, and the only reason it felt stable was that a handful of functions, a sword here, a shield there, a man with a mailbag, kept getting slotted back in to cover the seams. Royalty needs a story to matter. The Postman never did. He just needed a bag, a route, and a reason to knock. Give something a function, and it becomes unkillable. But there's a system in this series so functional, so instantly readable, that it has never needed a single word of explanation in 40 years, and you learned it before you could even read. Rupee colors. You have never once been told what a red rupee is worth. Nobody sat you down and explained it. You just know, the same way you know green is worse and purple is better, and that knowledge arrived without a tutorial, a menu, or a single line of dialogue. That is not normal for a fantasy currency. Most invented economies need a chart, a merchant explaining exchange rates, some wizard mumbling about denominations. Hyrule skipped all of it. Green rupees sit at the bottom, worth 1. Blue jumps to 5, red climbs to 20, purple hits 50, and the silver and gold variants stack up into the hundreds. Nobody explains this hierarchy inside the games themselves. It simply gets absorbed the way you absorb. Which candy wrapper means expensive chocolate without reading a label? That absorption is the actual trick. Across dozens of titles and multiple console generations, from chunky cartridge graphics to crisp Switch visuals, the color values barely moved. Compare that to the Postman from a few entries back, a man who survives inside these games purely by clocking in and doing a job everyone recognizes as a job. The rupee system does not survive because it performs a function you can name. It survives because your brain filed it away as fact before you ever had the vocabulary to question it. And the proof is not in the games, it is in you. Watch what happens when a title breaks the pattern. Give players a rupee that is the wrong color for its value, and the reaction is instant. People flag it, screenshot it, argue about it online within hours, treating a 2-second color swap like a small betrayal. That flinch is not nostalgia talking. It is a trained reflex getting interrupted mid-reflex, which is a considerably stranger thing to witness, because that means the palette was never decoration sitting on top of the economy. It was the economy, running as a language installed directly into the player rather than a fact printed anywhere on screen. You spent 40 years assuming Hyrule taught you how its world worked. It turns out Hyrule taught you nothing. It just repeated 4 colors often enough that you did the teaching yourself, quietly, without ever noticing the lesson had started. That is a genuinely unsettling place to land if you sit with it. The one piece of this world that never got rebuilt, redrawn, or retconned is not a place, a face, or a name. It is a reflex sitting behind your own eyes, and you have been calling it a memory of Hyrule this entire time. The most durable thing in the series was never on screen. It was installed in you, which makes it stranger that one of the most beloved things Nintendo ever built almost never made it in at all, and survived only because it was a mistake nobody had the heart to delete. The Bomb Chew. A bomb that crawls across the floor and hunts you down should not be one of the most beloved items in Zelda history. And yet here we are. Every other bomb in this series sits still. You place it, you back away, it goes off. Simple. The Bomb Chew breaks that rule completely. It skitters along the ground on its own, turns corners, chases enemies, and detonates on contact like it has somewhere to be. It is the one explosive in Hyrule with a personality. The official explanation is that it is just a variant bomb type, a tool for puzzles you cannot solve any other way. Certain switches sit behind walls. Certain enemies only die to something that can curve around a corner. Fine. That is the surface reason it exists. But the deeper reason fans keep bringing up is messier, and it is repeated so often in the community that it has basically become folklore. The idea that this thing barely made it into Ocarina of Time at all. Nobody has produced a memo or a cut design document proving it. There is no confirmed timeline here. What exists is a widely shared fan account passed around for years that the Bomb Chew was one of the stranger experiments that almost did not survive to launch. Take that for what it is, a rumor with staying power rather than a verified fact, but the item itself makes the rumor easy to believe. It behaves like nothing else in the game. It does not follow the internal logic every other tool respects. It feels like a mechanic that escaped the lab before anyone could decide whether it belonged. And that lines up with something uglier than nostalgia. If a reflex got installed in you, the kind we just watched form section by section, then the ingredients that built that reflex were never guaranteed to make the cut. The kid who grew up certain they knew this world by heart was actually memorizing a lineup of survivors. Some items got cut, this one did not. You did not fall in love with Hyrule. You fell in love with whatever happened to still be standing when the deadline hit. Familiarity did not protect the Bomb Chew. Nothing protects anything here. It survived on luck, and luck repeated often enough starts looking like intention. That is the trick. That is always the trick. Some of what we call canon only exists because a deadline arrived before an objection did, which raises an uglier question about the things this series never explained at all, the two peoples of Hyrule that fans have spent decades trying to connect, where the silence has never once broken. Zora and Rito. The biggest fight in Zelda lore has no winner, and it was never designed to have one. Fans have spent decades arguing about whether the Rito are just Zora who evolved wings after the Great Flood, splitting timelines and comment sections in half. Nintendo has had over 40 years and dozens of games to end the argument with a single line of dialogue. It never has. The surface read feels obvious. Zora live in water, Rito live in the sky, and Wind Waker shows a flooded Hyrule where the old world drowned and something new had to survive. Fans connected the dots themselves, and the dots looked clean. Same general shape, similar culture around a mountain or a domain, elders who talk like they remember being something else. That is pattern recognition. Doing the work canon never did. Nobody in any game states that Rito descend from Zora. Not a sage, not an elder, not a loading screen. Different eras show different Hyrules with different species living under different rules, and the connective tissue fans assume exists was never actually written down. Nothing in canon confirms this outright, but follow the pattern fans have followed for decades. Two species that look like cousins, acting like a franchise never bothered to clarify a relationship it clearly benefits from. That benefit is the part people miss. The same instinct that made you believe Hyrule was one continuous kingdom is the instinct doing the work here, filling a gap with familiarity because the shape feels right. You wanted a family tree. Nintendo gave you a resemblance and let you build the tree yourself. The silence is not an accident sitting there waiting to be solved. A confirmed lineage becomes a fact the next game has to honor, and this series has spent 40 years refusing to owe anyone a fact. Leaving it open means every future title gets to use Zora and Rito however the story requires, connected or not, without contradicting anything. Nintendo protects itself by never confirming anything. But there's a figure in this series who exists purely because someone on the development team thought something was funny once, and he's outlasted entire mechanics that had actual reasons to exist. The Running Man. Somewhere in Hyrule, a man is running. He has no name, no weapon, no quest. He just runs. That is not a metaphor. He shows up across some of the most beloved games in the series, doing exactly one thing, and Nintendo has never once explained why he is there. Compare that to what you just watched. A hero's lineage gets buried under decades of silence, but a jogger with zero plot function gets remembered forever anyway. The official explanation is that he does not have one. He is not a side quest. He is not a boss. He is not tied to a temple, a bloodline, or a prophecy. He simply appears, jogging past you on a road, sometimes racing you, sometimes just vanishing into the tree line, and the games move on like nothing happened. Players noticed him showing up in A Link to the Past, back in 1991, then again in Ocarina of Time, in different art styles, different tones, different hardware generations, and somehow he always reads as the same guy. He is not in every Hyrule, he never shows up in Breath of the Wild or Tears of the Kingdom, no jogger waiting on some road in the middle of a ruined kingdom. Nobody at Nintendo has ever gone on record explaining who he is supposed to be. There is no developer interview breaking down his motivation, there is no item description, no NPC dialogue, no environmental storytelling that gives him a reason to exist beyond existing. That is exactly why fans have basically adopted him. Nothing in the games states this outright, but the pattern is hard to ignore once you see it. A series obsessed with reinventing itself keeps finding room for one guy whose entire identity is momentum. He is not lore, he is a habit Nintendo picked up a couple of times and never fully explained, and the players decided that habit meant something, because the alternative, that it means nothing at all, felt worse. That is the trade every returning player makes without noticing. You cling to the recognizable thing because the rest of the map keeps getting redrawn under your feet, so the strange part is not that a background character became beloved. It is that a couple of cameos turned him permanent in the fandom's memory, while things people actually needed answered. Stay locked in a drawer marked maybe. Meaninglessness gets a free pass to immortality here. But the series' single most important figure doesn't get that luxury. He gets rebuilt from scratch every time. And there's exactly one rule Nintendo will not break when they do it. Ganon's pig form. Zelda's ultimate evil does not have a body. He has whatever body the game needs him to have that year, and somehow you have never once failed to recognize him. That should not work. A villain is supposed to be a fixed thing, a face you learn and carry across decades of sequels. Ganon has been a towering beast bristling with fur, a snarling boar-headed demon standing on two legs, a hulking mass of muscle and tusk with almost nothing shared between designs except the feeling he gives you the second he shows up. Zero consistent height, zero consistent anatomy, zero shared origin story that survives from one console generation to the next, and yet the bulk stays. The tusks stay. The silhouette, thick through the shoulders and low through the brow, stays every single time, no matter who redrew him. Drop every other detail, and you are still left with something your brain flags as Ganon before you have processed a single frame of context. Your eyes finish the identification before your brain even gets a vote. That is not an accident of art direction. That is the same trick the Rupee palette pulled, just wearing a scarier costume this time around. Nintendo is not preserving a character across 40 years of hardware. Nintendo is preserving a shape, one your eyes can process faster than your brain can ask any follow-up questions. Think about what that actually means for the guy supposedly holding the entire mythology together on his own back. Every rewrite strips away another piece of who he specifically is, and nobody in Hyrule seems to mind, because identity was never the job the design was doing in the first place. Recognition speed was the job. Full stop. The most important figure in the entire series survives on the exact same currency as the most disposable object sitting in your inventory. Somewhere in that is the kid who grew up. Certain Ganon was one villain, one continuous threat carried in a single body, only to find out later he was rebuilt around that certainty every single time, silhouette first and everything else negotiable. Even the devil, in this story, turns out to be a design token, recognizable in a fraction of a second and stable for no deeper reason than that being the whole point. But Nintendo did not save that trick for something you could actually see. Somewhere in Hyrule's history, they pulled it off with a sound instead. 4 notes you learned to trust before you ever understood why, and that sound taught you a rule about this world without a single line of dialogue, ever saying it out loud. The Song of Storms. You learn the Song of Storms from a man in a windmill who learned it from a kid, and that kid is you, 7 years later, standing in the same room, teaching it to him for the first time. Nobody wrote that song. It just plays, forever, in a circle with no starting point. On the surface, it's a puzzle tool. Play it, water rises, windmill blades spin the wrong way, a tree grows in a hole that wasn't there a second ago. That's the whole pitch. It's plumbing with a melody attached, but follow the loop all the way around, and it stops being plumbing. Adult Link learns the tune from the windmill man, Guru Guru, who is furious because some child broke into his windmill years ago and played a song that ruined his blades forever. Travel back to childhood, walk into that same windmill, and the only way to calm him down is to play him the Song of Storms. The song you're playing to him is the song he's about to teach you, 22 in-game years from now, because you already played it to him 22 years ago, which is right now, which hasn't happened yet. Say that out loud and it sounds like a glitch. It isn't. It's on purpose. Every step of that exchange is scripted, timed, and repeatable exactly the same way every single time you run it. There's no broken variable hiding underneath it. There's just a circle, built deliberately with the seam sanded off, and that's the part that should bother you more than it does. Ganon gets rebuilt every game, and still reads as Ganon because you recognize the shape fast enough not to ask questions. The Song of Storms skips the rebuilding step entirely. It never had an author inside the story to begin with. Guru Guru didn't compose it, you didn't compose it. It exists in the game the way gravity exists in the game, already running before anyone arrived to explain it. Nintendo never bothers to explain it either. No sage teaches it to you. No goddess hums it in a cutscene. It has zero origin, and the game just expects you to be fine with that. And you are, because the loop closing feels satisfying enough that asking where it started feels like the wrong question to bring to a party. That's Hyrule's actual trick, laid bare for 4 bars of music. Nothing there needs a first cause. It only needs to be repeated until repetition itself starts feeling like proof, a loop with nothing at the center of it. That should be the most unsettling thing in this entire world, except you're holding proof of the exact same trick right now, something you've carried into every single one of these games without once asking what the drawing on it was actually supposed to mean. Business scrubs. A bush attacks you, loses, and immediately tries to sell you Deku nuts at a markup that should be illegal. That is not a joke someone wrote. That is just what happens when you shoot a business scrub in the face. You beat it, it panics, and it flips into a merchant on the spot, hawking Deku seeds and arrows at prices that would embarrass a stadium concession stand. You just watch this thing bleed sap. Now it wants your wallet. The setup is always the same. A scrub pops out of the ground, spits a nut at you, you fire it back, and the second it loses the fight, it goes limp and starts talking business. No cooldown, no shame, no memory of the violence that just happened between you. It is running a shop out of the crater it was just defeated in. Players have documented this exact loop across Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask, and the pricing barely improves with the hardware. The items themselves are rarely worth it. Deku seeds you could find for free 2 rooms over. Deku nuts you already have 40 of. Arrows priced like they were smuggled through customs. You buy them anyway because you are usually standing in a maze with no other vendor for 3 dungeons in either direction, and the scrub knows exactly what that's worth. That is not a bug in the design. That is the entire design. Nothing else in Hyrule survives on a joke this thin. Guardians got cut, whole biomechanics got scrapped between games, the kind of thing Nintendo axed without blinking. But the plant that overcharges you has been standing since 1998. Unnerfed, unpatched, unapologetic. Nobody's officially said it, but line up the pattern and it stops looking accidental. A creature whose only defining trait is charging too much for too little to someone with no other option is not really a monster. It is a business model wearing leaves. The business scrub is the most honest character in the entire series because it is the only one that tells you outright what this franchise has always been doing to you. You knew the Deku Nuts weren't worth it. You bought them anyway. Then you kept the receipt in your memory for 20 years and call it nostalgia. We paid for the useless thing on purpose, and we'd do it again, which leaves one object still unaccounted for, the thing you could draw from memory in 3 seconds, that has been quietly redrawn under your hands the entire time, changing its meaning every time you weren't looking. The Hylian Shield. Every player who has ever picked up this game can draw the Hylian Shield from memory, ask them what the crest actually means, and watch them stall. That stall is not a knowledge gap, it's the whole point. The shield shows up in almost every entry, strapped to Link's back before he can even hold a sword properly, and it reads as the single most stable object in the franchise. Bird on top, wings spread, that stacked pattern of red and gold underneath. Except the bird is not always a royal crest. In the Loftwing era design, that same silhouette leans harder into sky symbolism and Triforce framing than it does into anything resembling the royal family's heraldry from later games. The proportions shift, the color blocking shifts, even the number and spacing of the triangles gets redrawn between generations, quietly, without a single line of dialogue acknowledging it happened. Fans have noticed. Go looking and you'll find long threads arguing over which version counts as the real one, as if there's a canonical shield sitting in a vault somewhere and every game is just a flawed photocopy of it. There isn't. Nothing in the games ever nails down one fixed meaning for the crest, so treat that vault theory as exactly that, a theory, and not one the text ever confirms. What the pattern actually supports is simpler and stranger. The crest was never one emblem. It was a series logo that kept getting redrawn to match whatever era it was standing in for, and it worked because nobody was checking. And that's the answer. Link's hands changed. Zelda's name turned out to be a title, not a person. The map got demolished and rebuilt so many times that Hyrule stopped meaning one continent. The villain spent entire games as a silhouette. The song at the center of this whole mythology never had a documented origin. Every fixed point you thought you were standing on turned out to be load-bearing air, and the shield is just the smallest, closest example, sitting on Link's back the whole time, changing shape while you weren't looking. You didn't grow up with a country called Hyrule. You grew up recognizing a shape, a song, a name, a crest, and you filled in the rest yourself every single time without being asked. The Hylian Shield's crest never meant one thing, because it was never supposed to. It meant Hyrule, and Hyrule was never a country. It was a feeling Nintendo kept redrawing until we agreed to recognize it. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.